Hey, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us for a moment while we were dealing with the local difficulty, but we are back and we are joined by the very lovely, incredible Dr. Shakti, who is going to talk to us more about the roots of social justice. So I'm going to kick it over to her. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cheryl. Cheryl's amazing. I know you all know that she's amazing, but she's just a wonderful human being. I'm very happy to be with all of you this afternoon, and I hope that you've had a great morning and a great yesterday if you were with us yesterday. As Cheryl said, we're going to be talking about the roots of social justice today. So let's go to the very next slide number 2. So I always begin with Conocimiento. And even though some of you may have been here yesterday, I'm going to review that again and again for tomorrow. So Conocimiento comes from social justice movement. It comes from the farm workers movement. And what it basically says is that in order for us to work collectively and make social justice change, we have to know our respective strengths. And we understand that these strengths are what really hold us together when times get challenging, which of course they do. They get challenging internally, they get challenging when we're working with each other, and externally when we're trying to make change. So we're going to take a moment to just ground ourselves, bring ourselves here, and see if there's something that we can find for us that's informationally worthwhile. So we'll begin by breathing, and I'd like you to just pay attention to your breath for a moment. Don't change anything. Just allow yourself to notice that you are breathing. And when you take a breath in, where does that breath go? Where can you notice it in your body? Are you breathing into the top of your chest? Can you take a deep breath and breathe into your rib cage, right below your heart? Or can you take a deep breath and feel your belly expand or your diaphragm move outward? So just pay attention to that much, taking a few loving breaths, being grateful that you are breathing. That's a good thing. So now while you're breathing, as you're breathing, just go from either the top of your head to the bottom of your feet or vice versa, and notice how your body is feeling. Where do you feel relaxed? Where might you feel some tension? And we're going to start doing some deep breathing. And to do that, I'm going to invite you to exhale first and then take a deep breath in, hold it for a moment, and then just let go. And you can direct your breath to those parts of your body that may feel tight or uncomfortable, or even if you have pain for some reason. So you're going to take an exhalation, breathe in deep, hold it, and then relax at your own pace. And now turn your attention inward. You can do that by closing your eyes, or you can do that by just looking down, but you're paying more attention to what's happening inside your body than what's happening outside your body. And you can imagine that you are in your favorite place. You could be at this beautiful lake that you were just looking at on that slide, or any place where you feel totally at ease. So what would you be seeing if you were in that place? What would you hear? What would you smell? What would you be aware of in your favorite place? So in this place, you have a chance to be with yourself. And I'm going to ask you to remember a time. And could you advance the slides, please? Let's go to slide number 3. Yes. Remember, deal with a significant challenge. So pull up a memory, a time when you had to deal with a significant challenge in your life. It could be in the past, or it could be in the present. And I want you to look at it as if you were watching yourself be on a stage. There you are. There's the challenge. And you have actually either come through that challenge or you're working on it. The question is, what are you learning from this challenge? It's offering you something. What is it? And now name a quality for yourself that you can see supports you when times are hard. There's something inside you that allows you to get through. So there's the challenge. There's what you learned from the challenge and what allows you to get through the challenge. And now take a moment to thank yourself that you are wired in such a way that you challenging times, which means you can help other people come through challenging times as well. So take a few normal breaths, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes. If you have a journal or paper and pen, it would be great if you would just take a few moments to acknowledge that you learned something by being in whatever the situation was that's of benefit to you, and that you can see glistening inside of this story, your story, something that allows you to rise, allows you to learn and to grow. What is that? We want to cultivate our wisdom, share our wisdom from the experiences that we have. Next slide, please. So now I feel like I can say, welcome. I'm glad that we're here together. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that I'm here. And I couch this body of work with this title that you see on the screen, As Above, So Below. And it's named as such because everything in this universe is relational. It's all about relations. It's more of an indigenous way of being in the world. And no matter who you are, where you come from, there's indigeneity in the history of that place, part of who you are. And understanding this connectedness between what we plant in the ground and what we receive as a result is just one small way that we could say this. It's like cultivating your strengths and learning and gathering your wisdom, whether it's yours or whether you're learning it from someone else, stands behind this ability to engage in what I'm going to refer to as social justice work. And we are focusing through the lens of race. Next slide, please. The image that you're seeing here is an African image called Sanchofa, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the meaning of this metaphorical symbol that's used by the Akan people of Ghana. You see that it is depicted as a bird with its head turned backward, taking an egg from its back. This expresses the importance of reaching back to find and remember knowledge offered from the past and bringing it into the present in order to make positive progress in the future. We cannot disconnect ourselves from the past. And I'm not talking about the past just in your own lifetime, but the past that has come before you and has been passed down to you genetically, historically, and culturally. So I am honored to be here with you. And I'm really serious about that. I'm honored to be here with you because it is this power of being able to find union in places where there seems like there's only disconnection that allows us to be on this human journey. Without love, we can't build the kind of healthy and personal relationships and vibrant communities that we're seeking to live in, to be in. Next slide, please. So we've gone through norms yesterday and today. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. I want to invite us to really lean into vulnerability. We know about respect. We know we need to listen well. But to be vulnerable doesn't mean that you have to show it to the entire world. It means that you tap into internally what's going on with you, because that vulnerability is providing a signal for us to pay attention to something that either needs attention or action, or both. Obviously, we're not going to finish anything today. And I would like you in your journal to pay attention to what questions arise for you. So it's not just that you're taking in information or I'm delivering that information. We're learning, we learn together, and we have to notice where the gaps are, which of course are abundant. Next slide, please. Yesterday, when Cheryl gave her beautiful introduction and went over some of the norms too that are very similar to the ones that I have here, she talked about a brave space. But I wanted to give just a little bit more about this through Bell Hooks, who's pictured here. And you can see what she says, that she's very interested in what it means for us to cultivate together a community that allows for risk. The risk of knowing someone outside of our own boundaries, the risk that is love. There is no love that does not involve risk. This is what lies at the base of being able to engage in a brave space. It's not like you put on an armor. It's like we learn how to open to what is possible in this world and address what needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. John Powell, who runs the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley, is one of my wise friends. And he talks about othering and belonging and breaking and bridging as part of the phenomena that we need to understand to engage in social justice work in a way that helps us move forward. And what he says is that the problem of othering is the problem of the 21st century. We live in a world that is beset by seemingly intractable and overwhelming challenges. And virtually every global, national, and regional conflict is wrapped within or organized around one or more dimensions of group-based difference. So othering undergirds territorial disputes, sectarian violence, military conflict, the spread of disease, hunger and food insecurity, even climate change. Belonging means more than just being seen. Belonging means being able to participate in the design of political, social, and cultural structures. Belonging means the right to contribute, and it also means that we have the right to make demands upon society and its institutions. Now, let's change to the next slide. And while it's coming up, I want to say, as we launch into this, I understand that many of you already know much of what I'm going to present to you today. So for those of you for whom this is totally familiar, please look at it as how you can expand your capacity for sharing information with other people. This capacity to share often can be approached by being able to ask people questions about some of the things that they say or admit or omit in their speech. And colonization is one of the places where we don't talk about it. If we can't talk about race, if we can't talk about oppression, no matter what form it's taking, if we can't talk about it with people having that pullback of protection, denial, whatever it might be, and instead lean in and ask questions, then we can't analyze it very well. And we certainly can't do the work if we don't understand what we're actually dealing with. So I am framing where we are in looking a little bit more closely of the role of colonization. The role of colonization, which emerged out of many other places and spaces in time where this idea of extraction and the rationale for extraction began to be formed. So when we talk about colonization to people, often there's a resistance elements around the issues of the slave trade. People say that slavery is nothing new. There's always been slavery. Yeah, that's true. It's existed over time all over the world. And secondly, that we need to include other people in this conversation who also suffer from racism. So this sort of black-white dynamic that we have that are the rails around this topic does not mean that Native people or Chinese people or Southeast Asian people or brown people or other people don't experience oppression, not just in terms of race, but in many other ways. But the polar opposites of this are black and white. And so bear with me as I stick to this frame in a particular kind of way. We know that Africans were transported all over the world. And in this process, they were dehumanized and despised, and in many cases, worked to death. They were the ones who changed and influenced the places where they were enslaved. And in the rush to be associated with power, other groups also participated in the power economics game of societal belonging, the rationale, who belongs and who does not. And so we have to explore the roots of racialization, and we have to, well, we don't have to, but I'm using this handout that's here that you can see. And if I can draw your attention to the bottom right-hand side of this diagram, we can see trauma, and that trauma is in orange. And this trauma, actually, the person who put this slide together is a doctor. Her name is Dr. Maria Rupa. And she's looking at this medically in terms of how trauma gets passed along generationally. And so we must consider trauma as we look at the consequences of extractive practices. So we have supremacy. Colonization in its own means to be disconnected and ancestry and from the earth and from our indigeneity, our earth-connected selves. We are people who live in the rhythms of nature as indigenous people did, no matter what part of the world they lived in. And I believe that this is not a coincidence that the colonization of this land happened at the same time that Europeans were burning hundreds of thousands of witches, those women who carried the traditional indigenous knowledge of the tribes of Europe. And this was done, of course, over a long period of time. Colonization was the way that the extractive economic system of capitalism came to this land, supported by the systems of supremacy and domination, which are necessary to keep wealth and power accumulated in the hands of the colonizers and ultimately their financiers. So we can see here that supremacy doesn't just play out in terms of race. We do, but we also have patriarchy and we have human supremacy. All of this gives the rationale and the placement of being able to be better than, to be wiser than, to have more knowledge than, to have more power than, and more economic control over the things that bring forth slavery and genocide and this invisible labor and child abuse and ecocide. Slavery, we understand, is necessary to have cheap labor because indentured servitude didn't last. And I talked about that yesterday. It is the way that we grab land. And it inflames who we are as a people. It lies and festers underneath who we are in this society. So we have to talk about colonization, and we have to talk about supremacy, and we have to talk about capitalism. Next slide, please. What you're going to see in a moment is a short piece of film. You'll have to rewind it to the beginning, Cheryl. It's picking up sort of into the film. If you could start it where it begins, that would be great. What you will see in this piece is that it's an old piece of footage, and at first you won't hear any sound, but you will see text on the screen. And we'll wait for a moment for this to go back to its beginning. Here we are.
Ten Little Indians. That's a song that was counting dead Indians back on the trails when they would kill Indians.
See all these little kids in uniform, and we'd be wondering how come they're like that. We weren't dressed like that, but these little kids were.
I remember being younger, growing up on a reservation, and being told, "Don't trust white people. Don't listen to them." You never told why.
The government schools are constantly being built and hospitals added. We bring them in, clean them up, and start them on their way to civilization.
I would ask social services and human services audience, how many people know about residential boarding schools? How many people here do? This never makes it into the history books. This is never talked about.
Why did those schools get started, and who started them, and what was the rationale behind it?
And the first general
Okay, we can stop it here, Cheryl. So why did these schools get started? Who started them? And what was the rationale behind them? Those three questions are very important. Those are the questions that people ask when they can't see. Those are the peoples that question ask when they don't know history. Those are the questions that people ask when they are also not necessarily open to hearing the answers. But I know that you have the answers. Why did those schools get started? And who started them? The rationale is all over the beginning of the screen, the cultural appropriation and interruption that takes place over time. But this way of seeing who people are, and even the talk about civilization and preparing people to grow in a civilized world, because they're not civilized, is menial labor. They are being prepared for exactly what they're supposed to do. And we can see these patterns repeating themselves over and over again into present day. The rationale is we want the land. We want the wealth that belong to you and who you are. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you about the system of inequity, which we all know that this is systematized. Racialization, gender, class, whatever we're looking at, it's all systematized. But I want you to think about embodying what this actually means rather than just the intellectual knowledge of what the words are saying. When you think about a system, you can think about your human system. Your human system, extremely complex. Lots of things going on, much of which you're not even really aware of, that are keeping you alive, keeping you healthy. And when the body itself experiences some kind of harm, everything that needs to happen, that can happen, springs into action, not because you tell it to, but because the brain and the body are connected. We move towards healing in many ways by doing not much of anything. We might go to a doctor to get a bone fixed, or we might take some medication or whatever we do, but the body is trying to respond. To do what? To restore it to its role of perpetuating life. So you can think about your body. You can give thanks to your body that it's taking care of you. The system of inequity has a purpose, just like your body has a purpose. And that purpose is to churn out inequity, and it does it beautifully. Systems, as I mentioned a little earlier, are all about patterns and relationships. So let's take a look at this. And while we're doing this, think about what you just saw. The system of inequity is embedded in history. In other words, history is the director of the actions that we end up taking to reinforce the status quo. That history is built into our culture, and that culture tells us who we are. But the system itself is driven by, as in the chart that we saw in colonization, it's actually driven by power and economics, the ability to make something happen, whether it's through money, through the process of discovery, so to speak, which is a perfectly wonderful thing to try to discover new things. It's the extraction part that's a problem, to take what does not belong to you in order to create wealth for yourselves or for whoever it is that is paying for the discovery that you're making. So this impacts us internally and externally. Internally, we have bias because that's what happens when we have to rationalize. We have bias that's both conscious and unconscious. We have privilege. Everybody who's listening to this has privilege because you're here, right? But there's a certain kind of privilege that comes with superiority that we have to notice where and how it shows up. And then we have internalized racism, the way that we have been taught to believe that we are less than, and this is particularly true for marginalized people. And it creates a tremendous amount of havoc and a tremendous amount of trauma. These things that are going on for us internally, which I'm greatly simplifying here, are played out externally. That plays out in our interpersonal relationships in our institutional relationships, our policies, our laws, our customs, that that's just the way it's always been kind of thing. And it plays out in our structures. Now, we throw around the word structure, but don't necessarily get that these institutional icons, they're represented by the icons on the right-hand side of the screen, that there is a way that there is a common language among structures that help perpetuate the status quo. It doesn't mean that you have to work in all of these areas at the same time. You're called to do whatever work it is that you do, but you have to understand that whether it's education or healthcare or banking or the legal system or the media or global affairs or whatever it might be, health institutions, that the messaging, the cultural messaging about what needs to stay in a position of superiority is actually been maintained through a historical launching hundreds of years ago. Next slide, please. Now we're going to watch a very short clip from a film that I made called Cracking the Codes. This is Joy DeGruy. Some of you may know who she is. You may want to take a moment, Cheryl, and make sure that it's right at the beginning here. But this particular clip is Joy talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she's written a book on this topic. She's a brilliant, brilliant sociologist. And if you're not familiar with her work, you may want to be. So I'm going to ask you to watch this clip. And I want you to pay attention to what you notice in the clip that is showing you how the system of inequity works. Some of it will be really obvious and some of it not so obvious. So let's begin.
Let's say that there are two people, 2010 or in contemporary society, that their mother, two mothers, white mother, black mother, or it could be a white mother, a black father, white father. It doesn't matter. It's not gender specific. But you have these two individuals. They have children. Say these two mothers have two sons. And these two sons play together. They go to school together. They spend the night over each other's house. They're best of friends. And they find themselves, the mothers and the two sons, at a school meeting. The black mother and her son are seated next to the white mother and her son. And so the black mother leans over and says to the white mother, you know, your son's really doing well. He's really coming along. And she goes, well, thank you. And she begins to say, well, did you know he's in the talented and gifted? And did you know he won the science fair? And did you know his uncle was an astronaut? Because she's oozing with pride. Wonderful thing. So then the white mother stops for a moment and realizes that the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. So she leans over to the black mother and she goes, what are you talking about? My son, now your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother's response is, girl, get out of here. You should have seen that boy yesterday. That boy's he's a handful. Stop it. Now, the white mother's response is, wow, they're so negative. No wonder. Why are they so negative? Now, within our cultural adaptation and norm, if you're African American, not even just African, you could be from the Caribbean. Black folks know that even though that mother's going, girl, get out of town, he's a mess, she's really proud. Everyone knows that, sort of, except maybe her son. So now let's take a look at this from a different context, because that's not healthy behavior, okay? And whether it's cultural or adaptive, doesn't matter. It's not healthy behavior. Why isn't she praising him? Why isn't she oozing like the white mother? Well, let's roll it back a couple centuries. And now you have a black mother that is seated maybe at the table cutting up onions, or she's working in the fields and she's enslaved and her children are with her. And a white slave owner comes over, could be white woman or white man, and they say to that mother, my, now that boy there, he's sure coming along. What is she going to say? She's going to say, no, sir, he's shiftless, he can't work, he's stupid, because I don't want you to sell my boy. If it's my daughter, I don't want you to breed her. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation to living in a hostile environment. We never unlearned it. That's post-traumatic slave syndrome. And while we continue to move on and we continue to even excel despite it all, there are some broken parts that we need to fix. And we can't fix it if we don't look.
So you can take a few deep breaths here. Ready to journal. And can we have the next slide, please? So you have a task right now, and that task, if you're willing to do it, is to think about these two clips and to go through this system of inequity. And in your to be able to check off, or at least allude to, make a few bullet points that relate to, where did you see history? And what did you see in the history? In other words, how did this story come to be? These two stories. You can focus on one or the other if that makes it easier for you, or you can go back and forth between the two. But it is the history that makes this story possible. What is the history that you're looking at? That's an easy one. What do you see that speaks to the culture, particularly in terms of who belongs and who doesn't, or how it's impacted the people who are in these two stories? And the identity, something that they say or that you pick up that speaks to culture and identity. Power and economics, kind of obvious, because these things have happened because of power and economics. But you might want to look for examples of that. But that's also a pretty straightforward part of this analysis. What did you hear that speaks to bias? What did you hear that speaks to privilege? And what did you hear that speaks to internalized racism? What did you hear that speaks to interpersonal relationships? How those relationships are broken? What about institutional relationships? Where do you see them? And structure is usually the hardest for people, particularly if it's not that visible for some reason. But this you must find as well. So you have about 5 minutes to go through this exploration yourself and to see what living examples, because you can see in these stories that everything is happening or being presented in the story. All these elements will play out in every story that you see or hear from that speak to inequity or injustice. So you have 5 minutes. You have 1 minute left. Okay, if you can just finish up what you were writing. Okay, thank you so much. Speaking into the void is not my favorite thing. I just have to say that because I can't see you and I would really like to see you. So I'm left to my imagination. If you are willing to put into the chat box some of the following, that would be great. What's the hardest part of the system for you to see in the stories? Or it could be in one story or the other. I had a hard part finding structure. I had a hard time speaking to institutional parameters that I couldn't see explicitly in the story. Maybe internalized racism was challenging, or privilege, or bias. Wherever you find it challenging, that just needs more investigation. And all of these things are happening at once. It's not like some of them are happening and others are not. They're all taking place. So please feel free to say something that you either learned or you observed, or what you found interesting, or what you feel you need to learn more of, and put it in the chat box. Next slide, please. So some of you may be putting things into the chat box, but you can still hear what I'm saying. I would love to get some feedback from you. But this idea of white fragility that Robin DiAngelo speaks to is something that I think that we need to understand. I mean, we need to understand it because there are so many people who say, many people, especially older people or white people, associate the term white supremacy with extreme and explicit hate groups. However, for sociologists, white supremacy is a highly descriptive term for the culture we live in, a culture which positions white people and all that is associated with them, whiteness, as an ideal. So check this out. This is not about talking to white people as individuals. This is where it gets messy. There is no one here or no one who we connect with who created this. We live in a system that we did not create. We live in a history, or the byproduct of history, that we did not create, that plays itself out in the system. And so it's not about, oh, well, I grew up in a family where I was taught not to see color, or I grew up in a family where I was taught to treat everybody the same. That's not what we're talking about here. It's not about your individual greatness or understanding. It's about the world we live in, where over 70 million people just voted for Trump. Why is that? What does that have to do with racialization? White supremacy captures the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white. And the practices based upon that assumption are very evident. So let's see how they play out in current day time, because the system rests on the historical and cultural accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralize, and it elevates white people as a group, no matter what. If, for example, we look at the racial breakdown of people who control our institutions, we can see that, and the statistics I'm giving here are from 2017, so they might not be completely accurate, but you can get what they say. That Congress is 90% white, and that governors are 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. President and vice president, current status, both white, not to be the same when everything changes and the president-elect becomes the president along with his vice president. But people who, it will also change, but the numbers there were appropriate, if not even higher. People who decide which television shows we see, 93% white. People who decide which books we read, 90% white. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. People who decide which music is produced, 95% white. Teachers, typically middle class, but not always, but 85% white, or 83, I can't see that number clearly. Full-time college professors, 84% white, and owners of men pro football teams, 97% white. So we can see that these patterns and relationships that really describe and project what the future could look like is something that must be interrupted, because it skews the capacity for people to step into their greatness, to have access to what they need in order to thrive in this society. So next slide, please. So I'm going to invite you to just take a quick pause and stretch. Some of you may need a bio pause. That's fine. This is just for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to go back and begin again. Yes, you can push yourself away from where you're sitting and do something else for just a couple of minutes. Okay, let us continue. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to be moving pretty fast through this next section. There's a lot that I'm trying to cover, so please bear with me. When we look at social justice, particularly today we're talking about racial justice through that lens, but again, it applies to all forms of inequity, is that we're trying to get to a place that I would refer to as co-liberation. And that co-liberation speaks to freedom and equity or access, and it includes love, relationships, how it is that how we communicate with one another, what it means for us to take care of each other. That is, in my mind, the goal in many ways, to put it very briefly. So this is social justice work. But in order to do social justice work, we also have to do the internal work, which we don't often talk about publicly, but I think it is becoming more normalized for us to talk about healing and intergenerational trauma and spirit and all of those kinds of things that give us a grounding in how we move forward in the world. And we can't really engage in radical imagination unless we do the healing work and the social justice work. It has to accompany it. It's not like you're doing one thing and then you graduate and do the next thing. This is not a linear model. This is not a binary model. This is a model that speaks to whole body learning and being. And so let's go to the next slide. One of my favorite authors is Anne Marie Brown, who wrote the book Emergent Strategies, and several others as well. But she asked this question: what do we need to heal in ourselves in order to offer a future of any real peace? What do we need to heal inside of ourselves in of a world that really does respond to how we show up in it individually and collectively? So in your journal, write down, what do you need to heal? What do you think you need to heal? It could be just one or two things. I'm not asking for you to write an exhaustive list. I'm asking you to just notice that the places where you're triggered, the places where, and I'm not talking about emotions. I know that emotions are something that in this society we often try to avoid. But they are indicators that we are alive and let you know where there may be some work that needs to be done for yourself. So write down 2 or 3 places where you can see that you could use some healing in your relationships, with your colleagues, with yourself. What are some of the places that you know that you need some healing? If you didn't write anything down, you may want to make a note in your journal to come back to this. It is important that we understand what it means for ourselves, which is this process of healing. Next slide, please. I want to spend this next section talking to you a little bit about emotions, the brain, and this, of course, has an impact on our ability to move to a place of co-liberation. Some people call it decolonized understandings of the world. I want to say to you that, you know, I grew up in Harlem and a blue-collar family, and I was deeply influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King as a child. And I was also deeply moved by Brother Malcolm X, who would speak just a couple of blocks from where I lived. I would often go and hear him speak. He would speak on 127th Street and Lenox Avenue, and then he would also speak from the mosque. But what drew me to him, as I was drawn to Martin, was the palpable love for their people and for having the world be a place that was more righteous, than it has been or is. And my work actually was in my community. I was always moved by the resilience in people that I saw. And I worked a lot with drug addicts and students. I taught brain injured, emotionally handicapped junior high school boys. But through this, I could see the intergenerational woundedness and the tragedy of contemporary pain and suffering. And I also bore witness to these amazing stories of human resilience, and what it is that we can do to make life worth living. This means that how to, or I would put it as a question, how can we maximize love and generosity and ethical and environmentally sustainable behavior? How do we drive forgiveness to be more of a part of who we are in all of the prison work that I've done? It's about a radical kind of forgiveness as well. And also understanding the inner change, and that the inner change is connected to the outer change. I know Cheryl and I were talking the other day, and a lot of people do say, well, what do you do first? Do you do the inner work or do you do the outer work? Doesn't matter what door you walk through, but we need to do both. And a deeper love asks what the heart and the brain require to heal. And so let's launch into that. Let's look at the next slide, please. Ta-Nehisi Coates, what he says when he talks about trauma is a big direct towards where I'm going right now. And he says, but all of our phrasing, whether we call it race relations, racial chasms, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, all of this serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, and breaks teeth. You must always remember, that means we must always remember, that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. So it's not just the physical violence, it's also the emotional violence. And this produces trauma. And unless we can handle trauma, understand where it comes from and how we need to address it, it's always going to create the dysfunctions that are happening in our lives, whether they're in our personal lives, in our family lives, or in our institutions. Next slide, please. My grandmother's hands, Resmaa Menakem, amazing person. If you don't know about this book, and I'm sure that many of you do, if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. At the end of this session, I will have some resources up for you, and all of these will be listed. But, and you can read this slide yourself. I'm not going to read it, but I did do some studying with Resmaa. He's an amazing being. And what I came to understand in a way that I had never understood it before is the power of intergenerational trauma. I could share with you the way that he helped us get to that, to understand how that passes on generationally. Suffice it to say is that in that training, in a room filled with BIPOC people, I at one point was looking all around the room to see how I could get out of there, because it was so disturbing and painful to me. And it helped me understand a lot of the things that, I haven't dealt with directly in my own life. And so I would highly recommend his book. What he says is that we have to pay attention to the body, because as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, all of this lands upon the body. And you'll notice that if you see an animal that gets hurt, what do? They move, they run, they shake, they roll, they do whatever they need to do to relieve some of the stress inside the body. And of course, our body needs, our somatic needs are tied very much to our emotional needs. And we live in a culture where we don't talk about emotion really. It's considered in a lot of places, and particularly in higher education, to be that airy-fairy stuff. But in fact, we have more information moving from the vagal nerve, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, going to the brain than the other way around. Next slide, please. So the vagus nerve, which Resmaa refers to as the soul nerve, is a unifying organ of your entire nervous system. So there are a lot of new advances in psychobiology which reveal that our deepest emotions, love, fear, anger, dread, grief, sorrow, disgust, hope, and love, involve the activation of our bodily structures. These structures, a complex system of nerves, connects the brain stem, the pharynx, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the gut, and the spine. So neuroscientists call this system the wandering nerve or the vagus nerve. But as I said before, this is often referred to also as the soul nerve. It's directly connected to a part of the brain that doesn't use cognition. It doesn't use reasoning as its primary tool for navigating the world. This is such a profound understanding when you really get it. And let me say it to you like this. When you experience trauma that threatens your very life or threatens you in any kind of way, it is mitigated by the part of the brain that does not recognize time or space. Some people refer to it as the lizard part of the brain, right? But we know that this part of the brain, its job is to preserve life. Just like a system preserves what it's supposed to do, this part of the body system is tied to preserving life. So if you get bitten by a dog badly when you're 3 years old, when you're 80, you would probably remember that as if it happened yesterday or even this morning. There's a part of your brain, the amygdala, which is tracking what it needs to protect you from. And it can really do a good job of what it needs to do, but it also is not talking to your prefrontal cortex. And there's a pathway between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that needs to be grown so that they are talking to each other. Next slide, please. This is a very quick visual part of the brain. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and they talk to each other and they perform very different functions. Next slide, please. So our left hemisphere, it is the part of a self-management tool that can be quite inhuman. Its neurons are ordered and the connections are local. And what it does is it's always weighing and measuring what's going on. This left hemisphere is the part of us that is very logical, very ordered. It's where we think we get all of our answers from, or we think it's the brain produces answers and we're looking for those answers in very particular ways. But here's what it also does. It also holds denial, dismissal, criticism, lots of contempt and blame and numbness. Some of us may believe or recognize that numbness happens sometimes when we think we're in trouble. And the left hemisphere is the home of everyday language. Next slide, please. Our right hemisphere, we can talk about, it's like a tangle of jungle vines, but it is the part of the brain that makes meaning. It is the part that does creative things. It is the part of the brain that's thinking outside of the box. And it can be all over the place. It is not bound. It's very aware of what's going on in the body. But these two parts of the brain, we usually favor one part more than the other, but they are talking to. And we could do a lot here about neuroplasticity, that the brain can change. And a lot of that change comes from us learning what it means to truly love ourselves, to provide empathy for ourselves. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to you about something called the default mode network, which is a part of the brain that supports the integration of the self with the social world. It's also the inner voice that can say things to you like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm all alone. I am not a good person. I'm too fat. I'm too skinny. I'm too this. I'm the wrong this. I'm wrong that. The default mode network requires us to distract ourselves, to drown out that voice that's telling us these things that may not be pleasant. Everything needs social interaction. We review what other people have said to us through the default mode network. It integrates new experiences, and it's that place of us that allows us to be creative. But it's active and talks to us when we're not paying attention to something in the external world. So all the ways that we distract ourselves, whether it's television, working too much, or keeping ourselves, we distract ourselves from the default mode network. We can't hear it. But for some of us who try to sit down and be quiet or meditate, that's when we can really hear what the default mode network has to say, or it interrupts what we're doing and fills us with lots of fear, doubt, and confusion about what's going on. It's processing all of that. This is a very important thing to understand because every person has an inner voice. And for some people, this voice can be a source of emotional warmth, while for others, it can be cruel and cause a lot of turmoil. Often when we hear the critical self-sabotaging inner voice, we are seeking approval from friends and loved ones to reassure us of our worthiness. We need to learn how to give that to ourselves. Next slide, please. I'm going to be going really fast because I'm running out of time. The default mode network, and you can see in the slide, these are the things that it says to us when it's talking to us in an abusive way. Next slide, please. It's interesting how our health is tied to our emotional well-being and how the brain directs that. For those of us who have trouble with cortisol or energy, anxiety, depression, compromised immune systems, panic, dissociation, and confusion, this is the realm also of the lacerating default mode network. Next slide. And these are the ways that we try to manage it. So I'll just give you a moment to look at this slide. But we'll all recognize ourselves in the places where we have trigger anger, where we respond to people with contempt. We retreat in fear or attack in fear. We eat for comfort. We drink alcohol. We engage in all kinds of risky behaviors, and we do that a lot through sports, through domestic violence, which is also a way to mitigate what the default mode network is saying to us. We take drugs, smoke cigarettes, gamble compulsively. We do all kinds of things. We have addictive behaviors. And so this is the way that we try to manage that can build up from the default mode network. Next slide, please. When we talk about self-care, for those of us who are on the social justice front lines, which is more than just thinking and talking about this, which is what we're doing, it's the actions that we take. We must cultivate the experience of being able to engage in self-empathy. That means we have to talk to those parts of ourselves that are criticizing who we are and learn the power of warmth and self-understanding, because that's what helps our bodies relax. This is a whole topic of exploration. What I'm offering you here is an invitation to bring these concepts into your understanding, that we are, as human beings, worthy of being held with warmth and softness. Next slide, please. So Michelle Alexander says this. She says, we need much more than a political revolution. We also need a moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution and awakening to the dignity and value of each other and every one of us, no matter who we are, where we come from, or what we have done. It is this revolutionary spirit, a revolutionary love for all people and for life itself, that will ultimately determine our collective fate. Let's make no mistake here. We are in a battle. We are battle in this world. We are in battle in this country. We are in battle with ourselves, and we battle the earth. This must stop. This is something that needs to be addressed. And it's not just changing laws, although that is absolutely required. It's a change that has to happen on the inside that matches our actions on the outside. And it doesn't matter where we start. They're all happening at the same time. This ability to look at and address whatever it is that needs our attention, but not individually. We can do that for our internal stuff if we want to. We can talk to friends too, but we have to work collectively. We have to change the language that we use and our ability to ask questions and to dive much more deeply into the rootedness of why we are where we are. That is the true meaning of the word radical. Radical means getting at the root, understanding what it is that's going on at the root of who we are. Next slide, please. So this is what leads us to radical imagination, which we'll be talking about tomorrow. And there'll be a lot of work in breakout rooms for you to start to dive into some of this. All of this is just an introduction that I'm offering. Some of you may have a lot to offer that you can share when you're in these breakout rooms tomorrow. But we do need to reimagine our relationships. We have to reimagine our policies and our practices. How radical imagination can lead us to structural change is something that is very different from the way we approach problem solving today. It's very different when we apply radical imagination to healing, when we apply it to social justice, and when we apply it to coliberation. What does it mean? What does it mean for us to deepen our collective internal change work and at the same time explore and expand our capacity for external change? So this talk about imagination is not just, superficial, but it does require play. And play is very good for the brain. Imagination is very good for the brain. So back to the question, what do we need to heal in ourselves in order to offer a future of any real peace? But what do we need to heal in the world in order to offer a future of any real peace? Next slide, please. So now, in this very moment, just try to imagine yourself in complete alignment with your highest wishes, your deepest love, maybe even your prayers. What if you were in complete alignment with your highest humanity? What would that feel like? Can you dare to imagine such a thing? Being in complete alignment with yourself, in yourself, with others, the people you work with, your family. It doesn't mean that you agree. It means there's a longing for something else. I'm actually inviting us to travel into our deepest love for healing and liberation. So if you're willing, take a couple of moments in your journal to write down your experience. It could be your experience from anything that you've learned today or anything that we've shared in this session? What new questions are you asking yourself? Can you experience a sense of liberation? What does it feel like? And how is that quality that you named earlier when we did our Conocimiento that has helped you get through the hardest of times? Can you illuminate that, the actions that you take to learn and to grow, and bring that to the work that lies ahead? Last slide, please. So everything is connected. Quantum physics verifies this. We are not just individuals having an individual lived experience. There's nothing that we do that is not connected to nature and to one another and to our own internal organs even. Everything is connected. Can we hold that awareness? How would it shift how we function? Everything is connected. And so we have a few minutes left if any of you want to. I don't see any shares in the chat box. I don't know if that means I'm looking in the wrong place, but comments are welcome here. Or if somebody has a question, Maddie, you would have to tell me because I think I'm not seeing very much. If there's a question that you have, doesn't mean I have an answer, but I'm happy to address something if I can in this short period of time. Well, I don't see anything coming in the chat box. I'm sure you don't mind if I end.
Do you see the page chat?
I'm in the event chat. Should I click on chat?
Go to the stage chat. So you see underneath the chat, there's a stage. People have been saying things. I want to make sure you see.
Oh, really? I haven't seen anything. I feel like I'm in the dark here, literally. Although I believe that there's luminescence in the dark. I haven't been able to connect with it. So the little thing is spinning. I haven't seen anything yet.
I want to raise just a few things while your chat is spinning.
Okay, great.
So I see Denise, you saying there's a lot to unpack. There is. I think that presentation, it left me with a lot to unpack too. Vanessa, I see saying, all my life I've been praying for the people to say that we don't want to fight no more. There'll be no more wars and our children will play. One day, one day, one day, one day, one day, one day, one day. This all will change. Treat people the same. Stop with the violence. Down with the hate. One day we'll all be free and proud to be under the same sun, singing songs of freedom. And that is beautiful, Vanessa. It seems like a song.
Thank you, Vanessa. That is
sharing
beautiful.
that. I see people saying it's very provocative. And I see people agreeing with that. Gretchen says her brain is buzzing. Oh yeah, Vanessa says this is lyrics from the song One Day here for pondering. So thank you for sharing that. Jim says this is huge for powerful work to be done and make our journalism ecosystem more connected in Philly. I see people saying this is phenomenal and thanking you, Dr. Shakti. I see people asking questions like, what does liberation look like in the future? What does our media look like? Who holds the power? Who is included? Who is allowed to flourish? There's conversation about changing language and how key and important that is, and changing the language and narratives rooted in structural racism, and how that's really a key to this work as well. And how objectivity is an illusion. And that I see someone saying being impacted by systems of oppression affects one's ability to be objective and emotionless. There's conversation about how in journalism we often ignore emotions because we want to maintain objectivity, and ultimately that is harmful. And things like that, healing, and how that begins with the thought, and by changing thinking we can change our life. And there's so much more in the chat. It's so.
I wish I could see. It's still not visible. I so appreciate you sharing it with me. But what that also means is I had some resources I wanted to put in the chat, and it's still spinning. So what I can do is I can try again tomorrow, but I can also send them to you, Cheryl, if you want to share.
Yeah.
Some of the resources that I've been using for what I said yesterday and today. And I do so much appreciate the comments that I did get to read, and maybe I'll get to see them later. There is a lot to unpack, but you choose what draws you. Choose the thing that you are meant to deal with. You have, I think I would use the word, we all have responsibilities. And if we pay attention, we can see what part of the fabric is ours to mend. And that our mending the fabric of our human relationships and our ways of being in the world, are paying attention to what needs to be healed in us and outside of us, whether we're doing that externally through policies and laws and practices, or doing it internally through somatics, or whatever the case might be. It all matters because everything is connected. Everything is connected. That's why I love quantum physics. It breaks it down very specifically. So thank you so much. I hope I can see your comments. I will see some of you tomorrow, and where we will take a deeper dive into radical imagination. And it'll be just not even that much, but we'll do our best. And thank you, Cheryl, for your divine hosting and taking care of all of us in such a beautiful way.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shakti. For everyone else, we will put the slide that Shakti has of resources in the chat. I see a lot of you asking excellent questions, and also asking if we're going to have a recording, because there's so much to unpack in what Shakti just shared with us. The answer is yes. We will have a recording, and we will share with all of you as well. That is the end for day 2 of Beyond. So thank you all so much for coming. Tomorrow, we have a great slate of programs. So we really hope you'll come back. We're going to start at noon with a panel of news executives talking about how they're approaching equitable transformation in their organization. So you're not going to want to miss that. It's going to include Lisa Hughes and Gabe Escobar from The Inquirer, Bernie Prezenica and Tom Davis from 6ABC, Bill Marazzo and Sandy Clark from WHYY, and Cesar Aldama from NBC 10 Telemundo 62, moderated by Cherry Gregg. So please come back and join us. It's going to be a really great conversation. But thank you all so much for engaging. Thank you so much for being so amazing in the chat, and just amazing as we sussed everything out throughout the session. And we're looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks, y'all.